I'm Judith Weiss, in case someone doesn't know me, and I'm very happy to open this panel, which is entitled Between the Lines, right? Is this right today? Yeah. Between the Lines, How Rereading Sources Reveals Internal Plurality, Disagreements, and Historical Layers. And I have to tell you on a personal note that several months back, Ishai wrote to me and asked whether I would be willing to share some of my research in this very interesting conference. And I thought about it for a minute, and then I answered quite frankly that I told him, I don't think I have anything to present on that topic. And he said, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing. And it was a nice exchange. But it did make me think a little bit about the difference between conflicts and disagreements and just, plurality, complexity, multi-layers, non-binary models of history, which are topics that are very dear to me and I think do characterize what I do and what many other people do. And we will have the chance to hear very, very interesting presentations about that today in this panel. And we will start with Ariel, right? So Ariel Seri Levi is a faculty member in the Department of Jewish Thought at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev and was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Conversion and Inter-Religious Encounters, where he currently serves as on the academic board. His research focuses on perceptions of God and religious thought in the Hebrew Bible, the composition of the Pentateuch, the Torah, biblical emotions, and biblical semantics. His book on divine anger in the Pentateuch is forthcoming with Magnus Press, and he will be talking to us today about the topic, Show Me, I Pray, Your Glory, Disputes over Seeing God in the Sources of the Pentateuch.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you to Judith and Melissa, Ishai, Raya, and everyone. Okay. Biblical studies often works between the lines. By reconstructing the textual history of the Bible, it can recover distinct theological arguments that have been woven together in the canonical text. Today, I want to illustrate this through one case, the question of seeing God in the Hebrew Bible, or more specifically in the Torah or Pentateuch. Can God be seen? By whom? To what extent? And why might seeing God be dangerous? As we shall see, the Torah offers more than one answer to at least some of these questions. Before listening for the different voices within the Bible, however, we need to make another crucial distinction. The distinction between biblical concepts and our own assumptions about God and about the Bible. These assumptions have been shaped by Jewish, Christian, and other later traditions, and they often determine how we read ancient texts before we even notice them. Before we ask how biblical sources disagree with one another, we must first try to read them within their own ancient framework. Let us begin then with that common ancient framework. The God of Israel, Yahweh, is not imagined in the Hebrew Bible as abstract or formless. He has an image, a form, a kind of body located in space, much like other deities in the ancient Near East. This visible body is often imagined in human-like terms. Within this conceptual world, various biblical figures can be said to have seen Yahweh, or at least some aspect of his visible manifestation. At the same time, numerous biblical texts portray seeing God as problematic and even dangerous. The most famous statement in this context appears in God's dialogue with Moses in Exodus 33. Moses asks, "Show me, I pray, your glory. Harenina et kvodecha." And God replies, "לא תוכל לראות את פניי, כי לא יראני האדם וחי." Usually translated, "You cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live." What is dangerous about seeing God? According to the widespread interpretation, human beings cannot survive direct exposure to the divine presence because the gap between the divine and the human is too great. More specifically, the divine body, and especially the divine face, is often assumed to emit a radiance or brilliance too intense for the human eye to endure. Consequently, seeing God kills as the direct result of exposure to overwhelming divine power, like touching a high voltage wire. The danger then is essentially metaphysical and automatic. I want to suggest, however, that this explanation does not fit the biblical evidence as well as it may first seem. Consider Gideon in Judith 6. After having a conversation with someone he doesn't recognize, Gideon suddenly realizes that he has been speaking with a divine messenger. This happens after the messenger touches Gideon's offering with his staff, causes fire to consume it, and disappears. באמת חשוד. Gideon then cries out in fear, "Ah, Lord Yahweh, for I have seen the angel of Yahweh face to face, panim el panim." Something similar happens when Manoach finally recognizes that he and his wife have been speaking with an angel. And he says, "Mot namut ki Elohim rainu." We shall surely die, for we have seen God, or a divine being. Strikingly, they are afraid only after the encounter has already taken place. They have seen the divine messenger, and they are still alive. If the danger were automatic, it should already have taken effect, right? One does not need to understand electricity in order to be electrocuted. It seems then that they are not afraid of dying as an automatic result of seeing God. Rather, they are afraid that because they have seen God or his messenger, God may kill them. This brings us close to an important proposal made by Simon Chauvel. Chauvel suggests that biblical restrictions on seeing God should be understood through royal norms of access as part of a broader social etiquette of eye contact. In the ancient world, seeing the face of a king was an act of access. It expressed rank, permission, proximity, and hierarchy. Some people were allowed to see the king's face. Others were excluded from that privilege. Think, for example, of שבעת שרי פרס ומדי רואי פני המלך, היושבים ראשונה במלכות, the 7 officials of Persia and Media, those who see the king's face and sit first in the kingdom. Chauvel's proposal is illuminating, and it helps explain why the biblical language of seeing God so often resembles the language of royal access. The question is therefore not whether God can be seen in general, but who may approach him, how close, under what conditions, and with what consequences. Yet, I want to develop this model in a slightly different direction. If we emphasize only etiquette, protocol, and hierarchy, the royal model may begin to look like another kind of automatic mechanism. Not a metaphysical law, but still a fixed rule that operates independently of the sovereign's decision. That, I think, would miss something essential in the royal paradigm itself. Royal protocol is binding, and violating it is dangerous. But the protocol does not exhaust the situation. It establishes the conditions under which the sovereign must decide. The book of Esther gives a clear example. Anyone who enters the inner court without being called is under sentence of death, unless the king chooses to extend the golden scepter and let that person leave. The rule is explicit, but it is not self-executing. The protocol defines the danger. The king's will determines the outcome. This model explains what happens when Gidon and Manoach cry out in fear of death. God tells Gidon, "Peace be to you, do not fear, you shall not die." And Manoach's wife reasons that if Yahweh had meant to kill them, he would not have accepted their offering. Their fear is justified. God may strike the person who has seen him, yet he is not bound to do so. And this is why their fear is calmed when there is some indication that in this particular case, the sovereign does not intend to strike them. We can now take the first step toward the internal plurality we are looking for, a distinction between biblical and later reflections on the problem of seeing God. While many modern readers explain the danger as inherent and metaphysical, the automatic result of exposure to overwhelming divine power, biblical text treats the subject within a royal logic of hierarchy, permission, and restriction. In this biblical framework, danger arises when one approaches the divine sovereign. Yet within that logic, the decisive factor is not protocol alone, but the concrete, voluntary, and sometimes unpredictable decision of the sovereign, whether human or divine. Now, we can take the second step and ask how did different biblical authors, working within this common royal framework, develop different ways of thinking about divine visibility, hierarchy, and danger. This brings us back to the Torah. The starting point for modern critical study of the Torah is the recognition that it is not a unified composition. This is not an arbitrary assumption. It follows from the Torah's textual and narrative contradictions, repetitions, discontinuities, and differences of style and terminology. The most comprehensive explanation of these problems is the documentary hypothesis, according to which the Torah was formed through the combination of four originally separate sources, labeled J, E, P, and D. This theory has been criticized in recent decades, and many alternative models have been proposed. One of the main criticism concerned the separation of J and E. Among the four sources, D is relatively easy to identify because it largely overlaps with the book of Deuteronomy, Dvarim. P is also relatively clear because of its distinctive terminology and style. The rest of the text, by contrast, is clearly not unified and is therefore attributed to two sources, J and E. Yet, separating them systematically has proven very difficult. Already in the early history of the documentary hypothesis, this difficulty led many scholars to treat them together as JE. Thus, scholars who accepted the documentary hypothesis and used it to reconstruct different theological outlooks within the Torah, as we are doing now, often distinguish between P, D, and JE, as if J and E reflect a single coherent religious profile. They don't. Eventually, this became one of the reasons why a significant thread of scholarship rejected the documentary hypothesis altogether, concluding that J and E never existed as independent sources in the first place. In light of these debates, the neo-documentarian approach, with which I follow here, offers a revised version of the theory. It still claims that the Torah contains four sources woven together, but it introduces significant modifications to the classic theory and responds especially to the challenge of J and E. Through a more cautious and systematic method, based on the close reconstruction of continuous narrative strands, the neo-documentarian approach offers a sharper and more consistent separation between J and E. It is very important to clarify that the separation of J and E is based on detailed philological analysis, which I, unfortunately, or luckily, cannot present today, and that it is not a conclusion drawn from theological contrast. Only after separating the sources correctly, independently of theological considerations, can we discuss the theological view reflected in each source. For that reason, the theological contrast I now discuss is not meant to prove the separation between J and E, but only to show what we can learn about seeing God when we read the passages assigned to J and E by this reconstruction. Let us return to the famous verse in Exodus 33, where God tells Moses, "Lo tuchal lirot et panai, ki lo yarani adam v'chai." On the reading I have proposed, this should not be translated, "You cannot see my face," as if Moses were physically unable to see God. It means, "You may not see my face. No human who sees me will be left alive." Or, more bluntly, "I can show you, but then I have to kill you." This is not a metaphysical statement about the impossibility of human vision. It is a hierarchical prohibition backed by a threat. This reading becomes clearer when we consider royal context in which seeing the face means access to a ruler. Judith says about Joseph, whom he still believes to be an Egyptian ruler, "Lo nuchal lirot pnei haish." We cannot see the man's face unless Benjamin is with them. No one imagines that Joseph's face is physically dangerous. Pharaoh makes the same logic explicit when he warns Moses, "Al tosef reot panai, ki beyom rotcha panai tamut." Do not see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die. These parallels clarify the force of God's words to Moses. Moses may come closer to Yahweh than anyone else, but even Moses may not see Yahweh's face. No human being, not even the greatest of them, may erase the final boundary and stand before the divine ruler in direct face-to-face access. E says almost exactly the opposite. In Exodus 33:11, only a few verses earlier in the canonical text, we read, "V'diber Adonai el Moshe panim el panim kasher yedaber ish el re'ehu." Yahweh used to speak to Moses face to face as one person speaks to another. This is a straightforward contrast. In J, Moses may come closer to Yahweh than anyone else, but he may not stand before him in this kind of unrestricted face-to-face access. In E, this is precisely what defines Moses' unique status. He is the one human being whom Yahweh admits into direct personal face-to-face communication. This contrast is especially important because Exodus 33:11 is not a metaphysical statement either. It does not say that Moses can survive an exposure that would kill others. It describes a relationship in which the ordinary hierarchy between divine sovereign and human servant is, for this purpose, suspended, and Yahweh speaks to Moses as one person speaks to another. Electricity does not enter into face-to-face relations. A sovereign can, if he chooses. In other words, both passages share the broad royal and relational framework. Their disagreement is not between a metaphysical view and a non-metaphysical view. It is a disagreement within the same hierarchical world. How far may any human being be admitted into the presence of God? Of course, we could try to harmonize the two statements or treat them as a local contradiction between adjacent verses. But the documentary hypothesis allows us to do something different, to read each statement within its original literary and conceptual context. Once we do so, each statement becomes clearer in its own right, and the contradiction between them turns out to be one expression of a broader disagreement between two religious outlooks, a sanctuary-oriented theology expressed in J, and a prophetic theology developed in E. J imagines Yahweh's presence as located among Israel. For that reason, access to this presence must be carefully regulated. According to the J narrative, Yahweh comes down from heaven to Mount Sinai in order to join Israel, and this presence immediately requires strict boundaries. The Israelites are warned not to approach the mountain, touch its edge, or break through to Yahweh to look. Even the priests, Kohanim, who are allowed to approach more closely, must consecrate themselves under the threat that Yahweh will break out against them. The same verb used in the book of Samuel when Yahweh literally breaks out against Uzzah for touching the ark, Peretz Uzzah. This is not yet a temple scene. of course. But in J, Sinai is already shaped by what we might call a sanctuary logic, the logic of divine presence in space, graded access, consecration, boundary, and the danger of unauthorized approach. It is not simply that these motifs resemble sanctuary traditions, but the J uses Sinai to articulate the conditions of divine presence among Israel. Here, too, the danger is not automatic. It is the threat that Yahweh may strike those who cross the boundary. In this world, Moses stands at the top of the hierarchy, but he still remains within it. He may come closer than others, but he may not abolish the hierarchy altogether by seeing Yahweh's face. E frames the issue differently. According to the E narrative, Yahweh does not dwell permanently among Israel. His abode remains in heaven. And the central question is therefore not how close a human being may come to the divine dwelling place, but how directly Yahweh chooses to communicate with selected human beings, above all with prophets. This is made explicit in another E story, in Numbers 12, where Aaron and Miriam challenge Moses' unique status by claiming equal prophetic standing. Yahweh replies by making explicit a hierarchy of prophecy. Ordinary prophets receive visions and dreams, but Moses is different. Bechol beiti ne'emanu is entrusted with my whole household. Therefore, Yahweh says, Pe el pe adaber bo umareh velo b'chidot u'tulmanat Adonai yabit. With him, I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of Yahweh. E is therefore no less hierarchical than J. It simply organizes the hierarchy not around sanctuary access, but around prophetic revelation. We can now see the disagreement more clearly. In the sanctuary-oriented theology of J, even Moses cannot cross the final boundary. He may not see Yahweh's face. That is, he may not stand before the divine ruler as one person before another in direct face-to-face speech. For J, approaching Yahweh without any distance would violate the boundaries necessary for divine dwelling on earth. In contrast, in the prophecy-oriented theology of E, Moses is defined precisely as the one who is admitted into such a form of face-to-face communication. For E, the intimacy that Yahweh chooses to create with Moses, his uniquely trusted servant, becomes the symbol of the highest degree of prophecy in all generations. In conclusion, let us return to the question in the title of this panel: how rereading sources reveals internal plurality, disagreements, and historical layers. What we have seen today is that such rereading requires two steps. First, we must read the sources within their own conceptual world. In the case of God's body and divine visibility, this means reading the Hebrew Bible within an ancient conceptual world in which religious relationships could be imagined through interpersonal, political, and royal relations. In biblical terms, the danger of seeing God is not a metaphysical problem, as if the divine body were simply too powerful for the human eye, but a relational problem structured by hierarchy and intimacy, protocol and sovereign will, distance and closeness to the divine ruler. From there, we proceed to the internal plurality of the Torah. What first appears in the canonical text as a local contradiction between adjustment statements preserves two coherent and distinctive ways of thinking about approaching God: a sanctuary-oriented way of J versus the prophecy-oriented way of E. Source criticism allows us to read between the lines of the Torah and see how it holds together voices that once disagreed over the hierarchical gap between God and human beings, how far it may be crossed, and whether even Moses may be admitted to stand before God's face. Toda.
Thank you very much, Ariel. We move to Serge, right? So Serge Ruzer teaches at the Department of Comparative Religion and the Center for the Study of Christianity at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His main research interests are early Christianity and its Jewish context and Syriac Christianity. He has written on the New Testament in its Jewish context, as well as on processes of self-definition in early Syriac Christianity vis-a-vis Greek Christianity on the one hand and rabbinic traditions on the other. He has published extensively about the Jewish background of the New Testament from various angles. To name just two highly influential works are mapping the New Testament early Christian writings as a witness for Jewish biblical exegesis, and early Jewish messianism in the New Testament, reflections in the De Miriam. Thank you.
Very much.
Oh, sorry, the title, sorry. Okay. The title of his talk, Adepts of Paul and the Epistle of James, the Nature of Early Second Century Disagreements. Thank you.
Okay. After the previous talk, it's a huge jump from the ancient times to the yesterday's newspaper. Yeah. Okay. Apostle Paul addressed his letters to communities of Jesus' followers in Greco-Roman diaspora from late 40s to early 60s of the first century. His writing points to sharp disagreements within the movement, with the author perceiving himself as expressing a minority opinion. However, by mid-second century, his authority had been considerably strengthened, to which Marcion, who included 10 Pauline epistles in his canon, is a witness. This dramatic improvement in Paul's sway might have something to do, apart from the power of his argumentation, with his attention to the status of Gentile fellow travelers, which would fit the reality of the second century church becoming predominantly non-Jewish. Paul initially approached the divisive issue of the Gentile observance of the Torah ritual commandments in line with the broad Jewish Hellenistic opinion that such observance was optional, unlike the non-negotiable demands of abandoning polytheism and espousal of proper morals propagated by the Torah. He seems, however, to have also suggested that the Messianic times herald a significant change with regard to Jews too. While previously the blessed yoke of the Torah ritual had acted, again, in accordance with the Hellenistic Jewish opinion expressed in the letter of Aristeas and Philo, had acted as means to achieve inner holiness. In the Messianic era, that's Paul, this is to undergo a momentous transformation. It's from the Epistle to the Galatians. Why then the Torah? It was added long time ago because of transgressions. Now, before faith came, we were confined under the Torah, kept under restraint until faith should be revealed, so that the Torah was our custodian until Messiah came, that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under custodian. Paul here is an early witness to a broader Jewish idea of three great epochs of history. The earliest, before Sinai, characterized by the chaos of sin, then that following the Sinai revelation with the Torah's restricting effect on Israel's sinfulness, and the last times when a change in our stance vis-a-vis the Torah is anticipated. Here's a nice example from Babylonian Talmud tractate Sanhedrin. Okay, 6,000 years is the duration of the world. 2,000 are characterized by chaos, 2,000 by the Torah, and 2,000 years are the period of the Messiah. This transformation is presented by Paul as effected by the eschatological gift of the cleansing spirit, enabling righteousness without the help of ritual observance. And this, again, in accordance with broader belief grounded in biblical prophecies, for example, Ezekiel 36. However, Paul also adds a complementary sectarian track. The gift of the Spirit is engendered by the Messiah's atoning death. That's how it is expressed in the Epistle to the Romans. You can see it on your screen. For Paul, these are the Torah's ethic demands that constitute the just requirements of the Torah, that now, in the Messianic age, Thanks to the Messiah's atoning death and the gift of the Spirit, it is feasible, it is finally feasible to fulfill. For him, they are summed up once more following broader Jewish tendency in Leviticus 19:18, and I quote from Galatians, "For the whole Torah is fulfilled in the one word, in the one saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus' atoning death thus means the forgiveness of earlier sins, while the Spirit cleansing the hearts enables the righteous existence further on. This expiating effect of Jesus' crucifixion is famously spelled out in the description of the Last Supper in the Gospels. Here it's from Matthew. "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." It is echoed in Paul's reference to the ritual community meal as that of communion with Jesus' blood and body, meaning with his self-sacrifice. From Corinthians, "The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of the Messiah? The bread which we break, is it not a participation in the body of Messiah?" When encountering the real sinful existence of Jesus' followers, Paul had to offer various caveats, similarly to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were aware that even the sons of light chosen by God to be among the redeemed were still not free from transgressions. Yet this idea of a new mode of existence following Jesus' crucifixion would remain Paul's crucial contribution to the Christian thought. Can we speak of a resistance to this Paul's intuition in the 2nd century, when, as noted, his authority was on the rise? Looking for an answer, I will address two early 2nd century texts, the Epistle of James, that would eventually become part of the New Testament canon, and the Didache that would remain outside of it. But of course, their authors could not yet know it. The Epistle of James, dated by scholars to early 2nd century, already a period when Paul's ideas were well known and influential, differs substantially from Pauline writings in its emphasis. If Paul spoke of a change in the Torah commandments' sway and a new freedom in the Messianic era, the epistle demanded unwavering allegiance to the Torah, which itself represented for the author, as for later rabbis, the very essence of freedom. But he who looks into the perfect Torah, the Torah of liberty, of freedom, and perseveres, etc., etc. Leviticus 19:18 is viewed here, again in accordance with broader Jewish perception, as God's kingly Torah's commandment. If you really fulfill the royal Torah, according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. And against the dominant Pauline motif of messianic faith preference over deeds, as in Galatians, one notes James' emphasis on the preference of deeds to just faith. It's interesting. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you shallow man, that faith apart from works is empty? Oops. Correspondingly, whereas Paul appealed to the figure of Abraham as one who had found mercy in the eyes of God, thanks to his faith, before embracing the commandment of circumcision, in the Epistle of James, Abraham's faith finds its true fruition in following God's directives all the way to the offering of Isaac. All this prompted some scholars to view the Epistle of James as a pointed polemical response to Paul. Such an evaluation, however, needs fine-tuning. Paul's arguments are directed first and foremost to the Gentiles within the Jesus movement. and his doubts pertain specifically to the importance of Torah's ritual regulations in the times of redemption. The Epistle of James, however, addresses neither the Gentile conundrum nor matters of Jewish ritual. It focuses instead on the commandments of merciful assistance to the weak of the community. We read here, religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, etc., etc. Hard to imagine that Paul would have anything against it. Still, unlike Paul, who believed that Jesus' atoning death dramatically transformed the believers' hearts and thus their obligations to the Torah, the ambience of the Epistle of James is very different. The eschatological fervor is not at the front anymore, with Jesus' future return mentioned only on the margins and in passing. Moreover, the human predicament vis-a-vis basic demands of the Torah seems to remain as it was before Jesus' crucifixion, which is not mentioned in neither his ascension to heaven. The faith is supposed, as before the Messianic event, to help our efforts in reaching the true righteousness reflected in the Torah. No wonder that many centuries later, Martin Luther stated that the epistle lacked the Gospels and Paul's focus on grace, famously remarking that he felt like, I quote, throwing James into the stove, due to its emphasis on works. Was the attitude of James his personal fancy, or reflected a broader conservative opposition within the movement, which did not view the current period in light of the delay of Jesus' return as truly being on the verge of the end of days? Let me relay shortly to another text, Didache, teaching of the 12 apostles, usually dated to around the year 100. An influential scholarly appraisal is that the composition served as a rule of sorts, not unlike the rule of the Qumran covenants for the community of Jesus' followers who used the Gospel of Matthew as their gospel text. If so, its emphasis may plausibly reflect a certain social aspect of the movement. Its first part consists of the so-called two ways instruction, contrasting the righteous way, that of life, to that of weakness, the death. This faithful distinction, with the roots in Deuteronomy 30, reflects a broader Jewish, meaning pre-Christian tradition, attested, for example, in a different form in the scrolls. The Didache does include some elaboration on the Torah demands seemingly borrowed from Jesus' sermons in the Gospels. However, it does not mark these teachings as delivered by Jesus, integrating them instead in the flow of Jewish ideas of broader circulation. Most important, the text does not refer here to Jesus' atoning death at all. In other words, the call to follow the path of life is not based on any post-crucifixion change in our predicament. As before, we must show our best efforts to follow the two ways instruction if we are prone to fail. See that no one leads you astray from the way of the teaching, since such a one is godless. If you can bear the Lord's full yoke, you will be perfect. But if you cannot, then at least do what you can. And then chapters 9 and 10 outline the community's Thanksgiving meal. Now about the Thanksgiving. This is how to give thanks. First, in connection with the cup. We thank you, our Father, for the holy vine of David, your child, which you have revealed through Jesus, your child. To you be glory forever. Then, in connection with the peace broken of the loaf. We thank you, our Father, for the life and knowledge which you revealed through Jesus, your servant. To you be glory forever. As this piece of bread was scattered over the hills and then was brought together and made one, so let your church or community be brought together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. For yours is the glory and power through Jesus the Messiah forever. Surprisingly, wine and bread, unlike Paul, do not represent here Jesus' blood and body. do not represent here his atoning sacrifice, heralding a new existential situation, but rather the wisdom of Jesus' teaching as a true heir to David, and the expectation of future messianic ingathering of Jesus' followers. The demands of the two ways instruction are thus individual effort, with transformation postponed for the future redemption. The question whether the opposition of James to Paul's insistence on the transformed nature of the current historical phase represent personal fancy or a distinctive sub-trend within the early Christian movement is difficult to answer, definitely. As noted, the later appraisal appears to be more plausible with regard to the Didache. If the Didache reflects a life of community, here we have kind of social movement. It should be moreover observed that the tension between the two competing outlooks will be repeatedly replayed in later Christianity. For example, in the early 5th century polemic between Augustine of Hippo and Pelagius. Following his understanding of Paul, Augustine claimed that any righteous deed in our messianic era is possible only through the action of grace derived from Jesus' atoning sacrifice. In contradiction, Pelagius argued that to say that God gave commandments which are impossible for men to observe by their own effort, and that God will also punish them for their failure is a blasphemy. So it is one's duty to make all the effort to fulfill them, in line with their interpretation provided by Jesus. A telling compromise was eventually reached, speaking about the joint action of human will and God's saving grace. With necessary adjustments, it echoes the one ascribed by Josephus to Pharisees. These assign all to providence, in our case to grace, and to God, and yet allow that to do what is right or the contrary is principally in the power of man, although fate does cooperate in every action. It deserves notice again that in the case of Pelagius and Augustine, we know that each of them had followers. So the conflict and tension definitely had a social aspect. Thank you.
Thank you. And we move on to Miriam. Miriam Goldstein was trained at Harvard, Cambridge, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and is professor in the Department of Arabic Language and Literature of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's author of Judeo-Arabic Parody of the Life of Jesus, the Toldot Yeshu Helen Narrative 2023, and Karat Exegesis in Medieval Jerusalem 2011, as well as numerous articles on Arabic and Judeo-Arabic literature. She co-edited Beyond Religious Borders, Interaction and Intellectual Exchange in the Medieval Islamic World 2011, and Authorship in Medieval Arabic and Persian Literatures 2019. Her work has been supported by the Israel Science Foundation, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, the Minerva Stiftung, and the German-Israeli Foundation for Scientific Research and Development. She currently leads the project Parodies on the Life of Jesus in Yemen, towards the origins and development of the Toldot Yeshu literature, also funded by the Israeli Science Foundation. And she will be talking to us today on the topic, Between Preservation and Polemic, Variant Exegetical Views in 10th Century Baghdad, as represented in Yaaqub al-Qirqisani's Book of Gardens and Parks, Kitab, al-Riyad, wal-Hada'iq.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers, Melissa and Yishai. It's really been a pleasure to meet you, to the CSoC and its board. So many of you are here. Thank you to the Ben-Gurion faculty and students who are here. You make us all feel so welcome. So thank you very much. And I've really appreciated learning from all of you and being a part of this kind of small workshop where you get to meet new and interesting people and hear about new and interesting research. And it's really a pleasure. I also welcome the members of the Karaite community who honor us with their presence. Mamash toda לקהילה הקראית שהגיעה מרחוק. זה מאוד מאוד משמח. Okay, we come from a lot of different fields. Some of you here are familiar with Judeo-Arabic sources and Karaite sources, and many of you are not. So I'm very aware of that when I present. And I want to first say a couple of words about things that appear in the title so that we're all more or less on the same page. So I'm speaking today about a scholar whose name is Yaaqub al-Qirqisani, who lived in Baghdad, was active in the first third of the 10th century, so the early 900s. He was a contemporary of Saadia Gaon. He was a really revolutionary figure in Judeo-Arabic literature and also in Karaite literature. So this is part of a whole revolution in Jewish life, where writing in Judeo-Arabic meant that many, many things changed. And Qirqisani was sort of at the center of this revolution. He lived in Baghdad at the same time that an important Karaite community was forming in Jerusalem in the 900s, led by Daniel al-Qumasi. But in any case, sort of two important poles of very revolutionary scholarship in Judeo-Arabic. I'm speaking about his book of gardens and parks, Kitab al-Riyad wal-Hada'iq, which I'm right now completing, inshallah, God willing, Ba'azrat Hashem, an edition and translation of his commentary on Genesis, along with a study. So the texts that I'll bring are taken from this project. Okay, so I think I said that. So it's called Kitab al-Riyad wal-Hada'iq, but it's simply a commentary, the first ever single-authored commentary, if you put Philo aside, authored by a Jew on the Torah. Okay, so he's the first Jew to sit down and write from Genesis 1 to Deuteronomy 32. Okay, let's see. Okay, second of all, so that was to get you into the feeling. So I'm showing you here the Islamic Arabic-speaking world that we're talking about. This was the audience of Qirqisani's work. A brief introduction to the work that I took the excerpts from. So this is one manuscript, a manuscript from the 14th century from Damascus, showing one of the manuscripts I used to create my edition of Qirqisani's work. Connecting in to the conference theme, why did I think it was relevant to bring Qirqisani to talk about intra-religious disputes and divisions? What I'm bringing you today is from a section of my study that I'm writing on Qirqisani's work, where I talk about the reason, the way that Qirqisani deals with views of others. So on the one hand, he's sitting in Baghdad of the 900s. As we know from medieval times, not everything was preserved, not everything was available. Qirqisani had one goal in writing his commentary: to preserve views from around him regarding the biblical text in Baghdad. He was aware that not everything would be transmitted, not everything would reach later generations, and he speaks explicitly about his goal of getting lots of views down in his book. On the other hand, as an early 10th century scholar, active in a new authorial culture. So for Jews and Muslims, not so much for Christians, we just heard from Serge about many authored works. You know, Christians didn't always compose pseudonymously. They authored works and said, I'm the author. For Jews and Muslims in the 900s, this was new. To say, I'm writing this, I'm the author, I'm going to write a preface, I'm going to use this kind of chapters. This was new. So Qirqisani, of course, wanted to set his own authorial stamp on his work. He wasn't just trying to combine and present everything that could be said about the Torah. He wanted to proclaim his own preferred view and critique others. So what I want to talk to you about today is the contrast in his Kitab al-Riyad between the desire to preserve and also the impulse to polemicize. So the parts of my study, I basically took a section out of my introduction to present to you today, a bird's eye view. We can't go into the texts, and no, many of you probably won't necessarily want to get into the innards of Judeo-Arabic texts. But the parts that I'm going to highlight here are, first of all, what he tells. So his explicit description of which sources he uses. He writes prefaces. So we have access to a lot of the way he talks about his process of writing. And it's fascinating. You know, somebody who was sitting at Baghdad tells us about why he includes what he includes. Within Kitab al-Riyad, how he works with other sources. So showing you, I'm going to show you basically three types of sources. One is this type of explicit discussion. The second is when he cites explanations of others, how he evaluates them, how he works with them. Karaites in the 10th century were not against using midrash. They, as one does in the 10th century, you don't necessarily cite it. You don't cite it by author. They weren't citing any authors. They cited every single view anonymously. Okay, so midrash is cited anonymously. You just have to figure out that it's there. And he does it in different ways. So I'll show just two small examples here. Number three, something I'm not going to show you today, is the self-assertive way he refers to his own explanations, how he chooses what's right and says what he thinks is right. And finally, he has meta comments on why he cites other people's views, how he relates to what he's doing, sort of hinting at the audience and overall purpose of his work. Okay, so incredibly brief introduction to Qirqisani. What he wrote, we have his Tafsir Bereshit, which is in the Christian genre of hexameron, the first work he wrote in the 920s. We have a work you might be familiar with, his Book of Lights and Watchtowers, which is a halachic, polemical, historical work, lots of halakha in there. I mean, it's a treasure trove of halakha from his period, published by Leon Nimoy in Arabic in the 1940s, and a real treasure trove of material from the 900s. Never translated, just bits and pieces, but soon to be appearing in partial Hebrew translation by Chagai Ben Shammai and Yehoshua Blau. And then what I work on, the Kitab Riyad wal-Hada'iq, which includes 37 principles of biblical interpretation, which are simply fascinating and have not been fully published. Not extant other commentaries, a book called Al-Qawl ala Tafsir wa Sharh al-Ma'ani about translation and exegesis, and a theological work. I had lots of manuscripts that I could work with. This sort of gives a chart. This is the program I use. It's called Classical Text Editor. It's a wonderful program for making editions. So now I want to show you three examples from within the work. So very brief. We're not Judeo-Arabists, most of us here, and just to give you a taste. So how exactly to compose a polemic? So what do you do when you need to include other people's sources, but you don't necessarily agree with them? So Qirqisani has a very fascinating discussion of this question in an hitherto unpublished source, which I did not find. I'm going to tell you where the source is from his Kitab al-Anwar, this Book of Lights. So in Leon Nimoy, I mentioned that he created an edition of Kitab al-Anwar, the Book of Lights, in the 1940s. It's been around. It's a beautiful work. It's circulating in PDF and copies. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to help. Only in Arabic. Bruno Chiesa of blessed memory found sections that had not been identified by Nimoy. And some of them are from the very beginning of Kitab al-Anwar, where Qirqisani talks about how one should write. And it is absolutely fascinating. It will appear in this new translation by Chagai Ben Shammai and Yehoshua Blau very soon. And they provide also a transcription of the sources. So I'm lucky that they shared this material with me. And I'm showing you my translation. So what he says is the following. Quotes some earlier scholars, Anan ben David and Binyamin Nehawendi. And then he says, but this is not the essence of speculation. Haq nazar. On the contrary, what is incumbent upon anyone who adopts a doctrine in which he differs from his predecessors is that he set forth expansively the statement of his opponent and present their argumentation fully and exhaustively. So don't do what Anan ben David did. He just sort of trashed his opponents without quoting them. You quote them, and not only that, you really give them some space, and that he mentioned also all that may be adduced on their behalf to strengthen their case, even of that which they themselves did not mention. So you have to give them a hand, and that he followed this, then you trash them. Sorry. And that he followed this with refutation of them and with argumentation on behalf of his own doctrine. So this is exactly what Qirqisani does when he writes in the work I'm editing, Kitab al-Riyad. This is exactly what he does. So how do you cite views that you entirely reject? Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. Okay, so this is from the story of Lot's daughters. And he brings all sorts of like really X-rated sections. Little hint, I had to edit some of it for an article recently, so it will come out in an article in Al-Masaq. If you want to read really X-rated 10th century Judeo-Arabic text, I couldn't believe I actually had to translate this. Okay, so he says, he gives all these views. And then he says, so Benot Lot, after they escape from Sdom va'Amorah and they have to lie with their father. So he says, I'll just quote part of this. One of those who deemed this impossible, all the explanations that preceded, and suggested expansive interpretations. So those of you who know Arabic know that he's talking about ta'wil, of those who believe in the pre-existence of the commandments, claim that there was no wine present. I mean, there's wine in the verses, right? So some people said there's no wine. Rather, they spoke to him in a deceitful way via drawn-out deceitful speech, which was similar in its execution, its deception, and its resulting intoxication to the deception of wine and its intoxication. So that we can skip down. This expansive interpretation, this ta'wil, is impossible not just for one, but for many reasons. Okay, and he says it really, well, I'll just read it for those of you who know Arabic. وَهَذَا التَّأْوِيلُ لَيْسَ إِنَّمَا يَسْتَحِيلُ مِنْ جِهَةٍ وَاحِدَةٍ فَقَط بَلْ مِنْ غَيْرِ جِهَةٍ. And the issues regarding it are too obvious to require discussion, and the correct interpretation is the previous one. So it's very interesting. I mean, he absolutely trashes the view. It's impossible. I could destroy this from many directions, but I'm not going to bother. It's too obvious. And the correct interpretation is the previous one. So, I mean, what's interesting here, and he really brought many, many interpretations. And then it's clear, he really feels it's important to record these views, to bring them. Okay, so that's what he does there. Okay, then the second of three examples that I want to bring has to do with the covenant of the parts, the Brit Ben Abtarim. He's less nasty, but he brings many, many, many pages, which I actually read with a group of Judeo-Arabists. It was really even somewhat tedious how many views he brought. And it's a fascinating commentary. I'm not saying it's not an interesting work. So he says, regarding these issues, there are other interpretations besides those we have mentioned. Some exegetes claimed that the phrase, a heifer of 3 years old, egla meshuleshet, refers to the people who existed from the time of Adam until the time of Moses, who are like a heifer, who cannot give birth and suckle, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of more fantastic imaginative explanations. And then he says, this is an expansive interpretation that is not acceptable. However, I have mentioned it so as to not omit any of the interpretations of this narrative that have been transmitted to me. So what we have here is a really good example of how 10th century Bible commentary in Judeo-Arabic is so different from things that preceded. I mean, even if we go back 1 century to Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which Midrash tries to be a text that's above its time. The author does not come out from behind the stage and appear. If you're transmitting interpretations, you're certainly not going to mention that you're transmitting them. You just write them. So he here is completely open about what his goal is in this. I mean, he's really, he doesn't accept it. He calls it, what does he say in Arabic? La yaliq. Okay, it's inappropriate. But in any case, he's trying to be quite comprehensive. Okay, finally, I want to talk about an implicit polemic with Midrash. Qirqisani quotes Midrash somewhat frequently. Okay, so a lot of times I'll be reading and you'll look at something and you'll say, oh, wow, that sounds like Bereshit Rabbah, and you check, and it really is Bereshit Rabbah. And he doesn't quote it, as I said, as Bereshit Rabbah, but he doesn't quote anybody by name. This is just not something that 10th century, also Saadia, doesn't quote sources normally by name. But sometimes he does polemicize. So I wanted to bring just one example of where he implicitly polemicizes. Okay, so this is from Parashat Noach. So he says, there is a question regarding his statement, the statement of the Bible, of the animals that are not pure. Okay, min ha-behema umin ha-behema asher inena tehora. Why did he say this and not that are impure? And he says there is another issue, but we don't have to worry about that for now. So I'll skip down to here. What does he respond? As for the answer regarding the verse that are not pure and not saying impure, variety and changes in wording in that words take each other's places make it possible for one expression to be used instead of another. If he said that are not pure, without a doubt, what is meant is that it is impure, because when an issue has two aspects, if one is negated, the other is affirmed. So many theologians from the 10th century could have written it this way. ما له طرفين إذا سُلِبَ عنه أحدهما ثبت الآخر. So if you have a binary, you negate one, the other stands. So fine, like, looks fine, looks reasonable. It's very interesting, min ha-behema asher hi tehora, min ha-behema asher einena tehora. Don't make a big deal about it. That's basically what he's saying. The Bible can ikhtilaf al-alfaz. The Bible can have words that, it chooses one locution or another locution, not a big deal. But he is implicitly, of course, polemicizing against, for example, this, it appears in the Talmud Psachim. So Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, le'olam al yotzi adam davar megune mipiv, sheharei ikem hakatuv shmona otiyot, velo hotzi davar megune mipiv, shene'emar min ha-behema tehora umin ha-behema asher einena tehora. So in here, the Gemara in Psachim, basically a midrashic view, says we learn from this verse, the fact that the Bible said, from the pure animals and from the animals that are not pure, as opposed to saying tameh, okay, not to use the word tameh, impure. We learn something from this, they're trying, the Midrash is saying the fact that the Bible sort of turned itself around not to use the word tameh tells us that we should always speak nicely. We should always choose our words carefully. Whereas, as you see, Qirqisani says, no, it really doesn't matter. Don't learn anything from this. The Bible can say it one way, it can say it another way, really not a big deal. And I'll note, you notice that Qirqisani has 37 principles of Bible interpretation. This is not the example brought there, but this is the way he thinks about the Bible. The Bible, just like humans, speaks in different ways, and it's you can't make such a big deal about it. Alongside being a philologist, by the way. There's a lot more that can be said about that. Okay, so that's what I wanted to present, just a view into working with the concept of trying to be extremely comprehensive, but also trying to be able to present explicitly and implicitly views that one does not agree with in 10th century Baghdad. Thank you very much.
Very, very much. And we're getting to the last lecture by Gal. I'll go for the full version, okay? I didn't see any I haven't heard differently, as they say. So Gal Sofer, MD and PhD. I'm just reading. Is a senior lecturer in the Department of the Arts at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev and holds the Rosen Family Career Development Chair in Judaic Studies. His research focuses on the history of science, magic, and Kabbalah from the late Middle Ages to the present, in both Jewish and Christian cultures and across multiple languages. His work examines the transfer of knowledge between languages in Europe, the visualization of scientific and religious knowledge, and the visual aspects of learned magical literature. His first book, Solomonic Magic, Text, History, and Reception, was published by Brill in 2025. His second book, Conjuring the Arab Magician, Intercultural Histories of Magic, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2026. And he will talk to us today about The Call is Coming from Inside the Chapel, Superfluitas Religionis and Giotto's Infidelitas as Internal Critique.
Thank you so much, Judith. And thank you for the organizer for such an exciting opportunity for me to present a work from the world of art history, which is quite interesting for me. Okay, so Giotto's Infidelitas, painted around 1305 in the Scrovegni chapel in Padua, belongs to the chapel's lower cycle of the 7 virtues and 7 vices, where each virtue faces and negates a corresponding vice. Directly opposite fides, or faith, Infidelitas has often been read as a figure of external unbelief, the pagan, the idolater. Through such readings, the danger to faith comes from outside the Christian community. I suggest something different. The threat staged by Giotto's Infidelitas is not the pagan without, but the Christian within. The figure represents a crisis internal to Christian religious life, known as superfluitas religionis, an excess or perversion of religion. In other words, as I will show, the vice opposing fides is not simply lack of belief. It is a misdirected belief. It is a religious practice that turned towards material objects, amulets, all kinds of garments and other objects that promise access to divine power, but according to certain theologians, actually bind the practitioner to demonic deception. In what follows, I'll argue that Infidelitas should be read as a visual sermon against Christians who transform faith into superstitious practice. The Scrovegni chapel has, of course, been studied intensively. Dominant scholarly framework has often interpreted the chapel in relation to Enrico Scrovegni, its patron, and especially to the scene of usury. Through this interpretation, the virtues and vices are connected to the patron's need for moral repair, penitential self-fashioning, and public rehabilitation. So a major shift came with Giuliano Pisani's work. Pisani argued that the theological program of the chapel is best understood through the Augustinian rather than primarily Thomistic framework. More specifically, he proposed that Alberto da Padova, an Augustinian hermit, preacher, and intellectual figure associated with the nearby Eremitani, which are like 5 minutes walk from the chapel, stood behind the chapel's theological design. My proposal today is quite simple. If Alberto da Padova helped shape the chapel's theological program, then his sermons can also help us understand how Giotto's images work. So if Alberto da Padova's sermons can help illuminate the theological principles of the chapel, then Infidelitas should read not through broad iconographic categories such as idolatry or unbelief. Instead, I'll argue that it should be read through the specific language of late medieval preaching, and more specifically, as I will show, preaching about superstition. A second important scholarly point concerns structure. Scholars have long emphasized the oppositional logic or principles of the chapel. The virtues and vices face one another across the nave, and the details are designed to be read relationally. So objects held, objects crushed underfoot, gestures, bodily postures, direction of movement, and clothing all matters. They are important cues. So the question should not focus on what does infidelitas represent, but how does infidelitas negate fides? What does the figure hold? What does the figure wear? How does he move? And why does he fail to hear the truth being proclaimed to him? As I mentioned, scholars have read the figure as a pagan idolater or as a generalized emblem of idolatry. All these readings locate infidelitas primarily outside the Christian community. In other words, infidelitas has often been made to do what medieval Christian polemic frequently wants the infidel to do: stand outside, be wrong, and make the Christian viewers feel much better about themselves. My argument is that Giotto does something more uncomfortable. He lets the figure look like the external other, but then slowly turns him into a mirror. Let us begin with the image itself. So the figure stands near the fires of hell. He holds a small female figure. A cord or leash extends from the figure to his neck. His head is covered by a helmet. His eyes appear closed or half closed. His ears are blocked. Above him, a prophetic figure extends a scroll as if proclaiming divine truth. Yet he does not respond. The titulus, the text beneath him, reinforces this point, and I quote, "The infidelis limps, he dedicates himself to the idol and with side clothes reject the one who proclaims himself. Idolatry drags this man into the halls of fire. The erring mind bears a head covered with a helmet, hoping only for earthly things." This inscription has encouraged readings of the figure as an idolater again. But the figure is more complicated. The female object held does not actually resemble the broken naked idol crushed beneath the feet of Fides, as one would expect. It is dressed upright and visually quite ambiguous, which something that led some scholars to claim that this idol is actually Mary. The cord linking the idol to the neck of the infidel suggests that this is not an idol carried by the neck, but a leash held by the idol to control the figure. This is where I want to shift the interpretation. The object should be read in relation to another object in opposing figure of Fides, the small textual object beneath her feet. This is a breve, a suspended textual amulet often containing sacred words and magical signs known as characteres. Such objects were widely contested in medieval theological discourse, and once this is noticed, the whole opposition changes. Fides crushes illicit material mediations, the idol and the amuletic text, and the infidel, directly opposite, is bound to such mediation. The category that allows us to connect this kind of object is superstitio, what we would call today superstition. In the Doctrina Christiana, Augustine defines superstition as a human institution involving the worship of idol, the worship of created things as if they were God, but also as forms of agreements or pacts with demons. It then includes precisely this kind of objects relevant here. And I quote, "To this category belong all the amulets and remedies which the medical profession also condemns, whether this consists of incantation or certain marks which the exponents call characteres." Augustine gives us a shared category for the idol and the amulet. They are not separate problems. Both misdirect religious attention toward material signs. Both involve demonic agency. Later scholastic theology develops this point further. Superstitio is often defined as superfluitas religionis, not a deficiency of religion or lack of belief, but an excess of religion. It is, let's call it, too much worship of God, but worship directed to the wrong object. Now we can go back to the fresco. The Titulus says that the infidel limps. This has created difficulty for interpretation because if the infidel is on his way to hell, a limp seems like a surprisingly inefficient way, iconographic choice, let's say, which slows his movement towards the flames. Alberto da Padova, I believe, provides the answer. In his sermons, citing Goldstein, he writes, and I quote, "Our free will limps." And then he explains, "Sin is a kind of lameness of the inner man, for we are not set right as soon as we will, unless the grace of Christ through faith, Peters, has helped and healed our will." Alberto developed this further when he pairs blindness and lameness, and says that the blind are those whose eyes are darkened by wickedness, who love the present life and desire earthly things. The lame are those who know that they should follow Christ, yet want to follow both the word and Christ. Alberto cites here Elijah's words, "How long will you limp between two sides?" This is exactly what Giotto's figure does. He's divided. He hears or should hear the proclamation from above, but his ears are blocked and his eyes are closed. He's not a pagan who has never encountered Christian truth. He's a Christian subject who knows enough to be responsible, but remains cut between Christ and the world, as the Titulus also shows. The limp is not a delay on the way to hell, but the visual sign of divided will. This brings us to our panel theme, the internal disagreements. When Alberto discusses the first commandment, he begins with the expected outsiders. He names Jews, Saracens, and heretics as infidels. But then he turns immediately to Christians. I quote, "All infidels, Jews, Saracens, and heretics transgress this commandment. Likewise, among Christians, all diviners transgress this commandment. Likewise, those who use charms and characteres or signs." In this passage, Alberto begins with external religious orders, but the force of the sermon turns inward. Christians too can become violators of the first commandment. They can become practitioners of superstitions. The same principle is used by Alberto elsewhere. When discussing usury, he claims that Christian usurers are worse than Jews because Jews do not take usury from one another, whereas Christian usurers spare no one, even their own kin. So the external other functions as a mirror. The Jew, the Saracen, the heretic, and the idolater provide a language through which the preacher condemns Christians' failure. This is also what Giotto's Infidelitas does. It looks at first like an image of the external other, but its details, as we will see now, lead us back into the Christian community. Alberto's discussion of suspended textual object is especially close to Giotto's image, but it is important to stress that this is not an isolated note. It appears within a broader discussion of two kinds of superstitio, as a religious error attached to visible, bodily, and material signs. Each kind begins with a Jewish object that represents, according to Alberto, a Jewish form of superfluitas religionis, and then turns into the Christian analog. Alberto starts with the tefillin, which he then compares to textual amulets, to the breve. He discusses what he calls, quote, the superstition of brevia suspended from the neck. He invokes Jerome, and I quote, to carry on oneself the Gospels or a piece of the wood of the cross is superstition. That is, carrying the Gospels as a protective object, as though sacred writing had autonomous power when suspended from the body, is an example of superstition. Alberto makes this point even more sharply through a question taken from Chrysostom. And I quote, where is the power of the gospel? In the shapes of the letters or in the understanding of their meaning? And the answer is quite, simple. The power of the gospel is not in the shapes of the letters. Its power is in the understanding. This should be placed directly beside Giotto's image, A prophet speaks from above, but the infidel does not hear. The words are present, but understanding is absent. In the very same discussion, Alberto turns from suspended brevia to another form of material access, and this is now the clothing. He starts with Jewish garments, specifically the tzitzit, as an example of religious commandment being transformed into excessive visible display, that is, into a form of superfluitatis religionis. But then Alberto turns explicitly to Christian clerics. I quote, "Note that the same vices of superstition can be reproved in the teachers of the new law, namely among clerics and regulars." And then he condemns the excessive magnification of religious dress. And I quote, "We see the religious habit magnified by the costliness of clothes adorned with dyes and enlarged to excessive size." This gives us another key to infidelitas. The figure clothing is heavy, excessive, unstable. The figure itself gathers the drapery at his hip as though burdened by fabric. Opposite him stands Fides, whose body is controlled, stable, and a garment marked by poverty. The contrast is, of course, moral. Fides is rightly ordered religion, while infidelitas is religion swollen into excess. This brings us back to for me, the most powerful detail in the fresco, which is the leash. At first, it may seem that the infidel holds the object, but visually, the object also holds him. This is the most concise theology of superstition Giotto could have painted. It's like saying, you think you are using the amulet, but in fact, the amulet is using you, right? This is precisely how theologians describe superstitious practice. The practitioner believes that he controls a sacred or magical object. He believes he can harness divine or protective power, but in reality, he is deceived by demons. The fresco of the Last Judgment in the same chapel confirms this reading. There, demons drag the damned toward hell with ropes. Among those dragged are clerics. The visual principle is the same. The rope is a demonic tool of punishment. The cord in infidelitas anticipates the ropes of hell. The small female figure is therefore not an idol, nor simply a representation of the external other. It is a deceptive object. It looks holy, or at least ambiguous enough to be misread, but the leash reveals its true demonic nature. Giotto's Infidelitas uses the visual language of external unbelief, but the image redirects that language inward. Read through Augustine's category of superstitio and Alberto de Padefa's sermons, Infidelitas becomes an image of Christian superfluitas religionis. Chapel stood beside the word of the Ermitani, as I said. Alberto da Padova himself belonged to that Augustinian environment. So when Infidelitas appears as a figure trapped between magical signs and demonic deception, Giotto uncovered the danger in the Christian inside, and more specifically, the monk or the cleric who mistakes a demon's leash for a devotional accessory. This also fits very well what we know about the production of such amulets. As Richard Kiekefer showed in his discussion of the clerical underworld, the makers of these objects were often not outsiders to Christian learning, but figures who stood at the crossroads of clerical learning, liturgy, and devotional practices that could slide into illicit learned magic. Thank you.
The leash goes two ways, as we just heard. Okay, so first of all, I have to say very frankly that I had a wonderful time and I learned many, many things. And yeah, so thank you, our four speakers. We have 18 minutes. I will say just a few short things and then we will have time for questions. So have your questions ready. We'll take, like we did in the last panel, 2 or 3 questions. Okay, so just really a few words. I felt that this was like the opposition of this conference, because we were really talking, all four of you were speaking about non-conflict. And how conflict is really quite, in general, is perhaps a rather simplistic way to look at, to do our research. And I was feeling that the four of you have come and presented cases in which complexity and reading things as they are, in fact, shows us that it's not a real contradiction, rather something a bit more complex and perhaps interesting, and what is more important, true. So just very, very briefly, what I heard from Ariel's talk, which is very important for me also personally, that first of all, if we don't understand the context and if we don't look at the context as our departure point for reading the text, we will just end up saying silly things. And that many times what seems to be binary and contradictory is really a matter of diversity, and that many things could be true even if they're not contradicting, they could just be different. And if we don't listen to if we don't come with the questions and seek for the answers, rather come and seek for the questions and then find the answers, then the answers would be much more accurate. And that was very, very interesting. And also, I think was very, very similar in Serge's presentation. First of all, that we cannot make one step forward if we don't start from the context and understanding who people were writing to and why. And then looking into the answers or the content and understanding it through that prisma. And that many times, again, contradictions and binarity are at the eyes of the researcher, because we are looking for those answers, and it's much easier to present history through conflicts, and it's much easier to have an article published if it presents a contradiction, a binary way. And it's much easier, by the way, to teach that way too, than sketching a more complex picture. And this is a very important lesson for all of us. And actually, Miriam's talk was a bit different. And I think her case actually it's a case in which we listen to the person that we're trying to get to know and understand, and hear from his mouth that he is actually doing polemics. He says so. And you very sensitively not only listen to what he says, but to how he does what he does. And you try to understand from the way he presents other people's opinions. And he's not always it's not like he accepts everything. He's very critical. But this is what he does. So we're not coming and imposing our perspective as someone who is doing polemic stuff. This is what he does, and he's very reflexive. And it's a contradicting case. It's a different case that shows us the difference between these cases. Also, it was very interesting for me to hear that he's listening so carefully to his opponents and even helping them out present their own view and completing what's missing there. And I think this is something that's quite impressive and even noble. And we'll wrap up with Gal, a very, very interesting talk. And again, we see that we need to start not come with our views, but look at the context. And if we want to understand people, then try to find what's going on their asynchronic environment, and complement the visual objects with the textual information, and the so-called artistic with the so-called theological, with the so-called historical. And this is all the same if we want to understand. And it's also very interesting to see that we come with the with the assumption that the differences between opinions will always be differences between what we see as theological or other kinds of collectives, such as Christians and infidels. And that is not the case. And many things happen inside the groups that we try to divide. And it's very interesting for me to see that even the Latin words such as superfluitas and superstitio and all these supers, and in general all the Latin prefixes, I think teach us something about complexity and non-binary attitudes. It's not this or the other as tameh and tahor, right? So they're not oppositions, rather they're very, very different kinds of tones and different things in the world, and we should be listening to all of them. And that's more or less what I wanted to say. And since we concluded with the leash and you don't know who is controlling who and if there is anything as control in this world, this is also, I think, it's a lesson to all of us when we speak about, no one speaks about influence anymore, right, and research, because we know when there is a connection, then both sides are involved and things happen to both sides, and there is no escape from that. So now I turn to your side, and please, go ahead, Moshe, please.
Thanks for the lecture. The lecture is really very illuminating. I have some thoughts about each of them, but I want to ask Ariel, so there is the sanctuary logic, right, of presence, and then there is the prophetic logic. Now, is there a particular, I would speculate whether there is a particular reason why within the prophetic structure that more intimate encounter is possible, right? We want to move further because the one who actually initiates the encounter is God, right? You say, well, if it's the sanctuary logic, there he is, and people can kind of approach him. So the structure of distance has to be more affirmed. But then there is, then there is the D source, right, where it's a non-sanctuary idea, if I may, right? It's only his name, right? And he's above, but he's kol tmunayim chem roim zulati kol, right? There is a completely different idea of non-visual hearing. Am I right in describing that option? I might be wrong. So we have a third mode of relational encounter, right? It's not metaphysical. It's not that it doesn't have it cannot be visualized metaphysically speaking, right? It's relational in the D option. So I have those two thoughts.
Do you want to, I know, what should I take more questions or? Wait, this is not. Okay. אז תרשום. אתם רוצים, should he answer right away or what would you prefer?
Whatever.
Any more questions for Ariel or anyone else? Kana, please.
J is a Amami source, so this is a question. Because you presented two different views, but you said that it's a one source, so how can you explain that different views if it is from one source? And if we are talking about two sources, so who is J and E considered to be not priestly and not D? So it's from the people. So who would adapt this kind of structure of temple, of sanctuary, if it's part of that map?
Okay, and in order to not have a superfluitas of Bible, questions to some of our other?
Actually, my question is very basic. Like, I wanted to understand better who are the four letters, and like what epochs, like what do they refer to, and what epochs, because it will allow me to understand the other answers too.
The CSoC wing over there.
Thank you. My question is for Miriam. I have two questions, actually. Thank you. First of all, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. First, I wanted to ask, where is he taking this from, this approach to polemics? Is this something that's going on within Arabic culture of the time? Is he reading it somewhere else? Is it just him? Does it have to do particularly with manuscript culture in this period? So that's one. And the other is, do you see this, you mentioned how his openness doesn't make him any less nasty, and I'm wondering if you see this as polemics, like bringing these, and if I'm not mistaken, he keeps repeating how expansive these interpretations with which he disagrees are. Is that perhaps part of the polemics, showing that they actually contradict themselves as they speak, or that they require so much words, and so to be so verbal in order to get their message across, whereas he just has to say, oh, this is all just nothing, it's not important, it's just wrong.
Okay, so just Effie, and then they can respond.
First of all, I apologize for not being the entire panel. I was teaching and I came in the middle of Miriam's talk, and I thank all of you. My question is to Gal, whose talk I heard from beginning to end. You were talking about Infidelitas's figure and holding his robe because it's weighing on him. Could it be that he is unhinged because he's limping? And does that, what is that, what if that is so, what is the meaning of that?
Thank you. And the last question over there.
Also a question for Miriam, related to what Iris just asked. I thought about, when you were speaking in particular, about his own personal expression of his own ideas. It reminded me of Tabari. And I was wondering, Tabari sometimes says, this is what I think. Sometimes he gives different opinions and doesn't say his own opinion. If maybe there is some sort of connection, roughly, you know, this kind of literature is happening at the same time. So if you could speak a little bit about the broader Muslim context.
Who would like to start? Ariel?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank all of you. Moshe, first I'm happy to see you here. Moshe made like very similar arguments regarding Halot literature and Midrash like many years ago, and his studies deeply influenced by your work. So this is a piece of something that we'll discuss, the four sources. For now, regarding D, so there is a huge debate in scholarship regarding the so-called name theology, like whether D like believes that God isn't really in the temple but only his name, or what exactly it means. So maybe this is the reason that he's not so troubled by the problem of approach, but maybe this is not the reason, and I think this is like also something that when we look for like contradictions and disagreements, like we expect all sources to answer the question, and sometimes like there is a source that's interested in other questions, right? So maybe this is the case. What I can say that D it takes the problem from seeing to hearing, like no one has ever seen God, and D does so for the purpose of resisting idolatry, right? So because none of you ever seen Yahweh, you don't know how he looks like, and therefore you cannot make idols of him. And in hierarchical terms, the like underrating like Moses, like Moses is just like anyone else in Israel, but Israel is very special.
עכשיו נדלק, זה לא התחיל לעבוד?
Okay, so what's special in Israel relationship with Yahweh is that they asked, did you hear about a nation that his deity is so close to his nation like Yahweh with Israel? So like there are many gods and every god has his nation, but this relationship is very intimate and close, and that's why all of Israel can hear like Hashama Am Kol Elohim Vayechi Mi Goy Gadol Asher Lo Elohim Krovim Elav. So he takes the hierarchical question like in other way regarding the names of the sources, like they have to do with the history of scholarship, and they're really very confusing, and so it's not really important, but of course we can talk about it. And about J and E, like we neo-commentarians never use JE, not the J and E. I don't like the term Amami, like it's primitive and mythological. No, it's very common in scholarship. And so yeah, so you like you saw there is really like a novel idea that I like חידוש מובלע, that really I see J as a priestly source, not the priestly source, not P, but I believe that J is highly connected to sanctuary, the realm, context, for many reasons that I showed a piece of it today. So I think that's all for now. Thank you.
I'll be very brief. Thank you, Judith, for your really nice synthesis, and so much fun to be on a panel with these esteemed gentlemen. No, really. I'll be really brief. So to Iris, thank you for the question and thank you for being with us. Where does he get the view of how to polemicize, or the types of things that I presented that he talks about? The world of Arabic is this new scientific era. So whereas he really gets into it, as Judith nicely said, he's extremely reflexive. He really does like to talk about methods. He's the only Jew, by the way, since the 13 Midot of Rabbi Ishmael who decided to write, Shmuel ben Chofni is after him. So in any case, the idea of writing principles, he's into this. He likes talking about how he works. But I like what Judith says. He's extremely reflexive, but a lot of people have this type of programmatic intros. So where does he get the view of how to polemicize? We do see, other people also, when Saadia also, he's not just going to refute a view, he presents the view first. So this isn't unique. Qirqisani's reflexivity is. And the second thing that's important to say is that when he talks about ta'wil, this expansive interpretation, it's a term. So he doesn't mean like they're verbose and expansive. I just translated it that way, but he means expansive sort of fantastical interpretation, or where you say, this is a symbol of this, as opposed to the scientific philological methods that he usually espouses. To answer Gershon, thank you, and thanks for making it back. So you ask about the relation to Christian and Muslim views, and the question of, seeing someone like Tabari who tries to be very comprehensive, and, is this a general thing? Sources around Qirqisani in the Jewish world are also oftentimes trying to be comprehensive. I mean, one comparison that can be made is if you look at Qirqisani on Genesis and Saadia on Genesis, and there are parallels between them, significant parallels. But one important contrast is that Saadia is not trying to be comprehensive. He doesn't list many, many views and talk about it. Other Karaite sources do, by the way. So Yefet ben Eli, writing in the end of the 10th century in Jerusalem, is sort of, he does try to be comprehensive as well. So in the Jewish tradition, this can be found. Midrashic sources try to be comprehensive, so I don't have to look at Muslim sources to find that. But one very important thing to say about this revolution that is Judeo-Arabic Bible commentary is that these are very much intertwined channels. So you're right to say we should look at what Muslims are doing, and we do, and we look especially at what Christian exegetes are doing or did slightly before. We can't forget them. So, and the idea of exegesis at all, also coming from outside religious traditions, from Greek literature. So, whereas I wouldn't say, oh, we definitely need to look at Muslim tafsir literature, because since the Quran and the Bible are such different texts, that's not always, for terms I look there, not always for approaches, but to look at the general milieu, it's very important, and it's a wonderful thing to mention.
Okay. So again, thank you. Guys, sorry. My mistake.
It will be very, very quick.
לא, יש לנו זמן.
No, and yet. Okay. So thank you, Effie, for this question. The answer is, of course, yes. The figure is unhinged. Yeah. The figure is unhinged because he limps. But the point that I try to make that is to figure out what limping is actually mean in this kind of context. And if we are going to Alberto de Padova, which is based on Augustinian notions, we know that the limping is a representation of going between these two worlds, right? The material and the spiritual. So the grabbing of the garments and the excessive kind of garments in comparison with the pides, which is a very tight garment and actually full of tears, I think this is a way to express the material world and the superfluitas inhabitus, right? So yes, it's both, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry again. Okay, so again, thank you very much for everyone for this very, very, very interesting panel. And now we have lunch, and we shall reconvene at 2. So there is a whole hour, right? No? Yeah, 2. So you have lots of time to eat and have coffee and see each other later.